All right, let's solve a statistical mystery, shall we? Today, we're going to find out why even the most brilliant math can't rescue you from a foundation of bad data. Okay, so let's set the scene. Our case file is the 1936 presidential election. A huge magazine at the time, the Literary Digest, ran this massive poll. And their prediction? A blowout victory for Alf Landon. But what actually happened was a total shocker. FDR didn't just win, he won in one of the biggest landslides in U.S. history. I mean, this wasn't just a little oops, it was a complete and utter faceplant. So how did this happen? To figure it out, we have to become data detectives. And the culprit we're looking for? It's a little thing called bias. So where do we start our investigation? Well, our first clue is all about who they talked to, and maybe even more importantly, who they didn't talk to. This leads us straight to our first suspect, under coverage. Think of it like this. The golden rule of any good survey is that everybody in the group you're studying should have a fair shot at being picked. If your method basically ignores a whole chunk of people, your sample is tilted from the very beginning, and that is exactly what happened with the Literary Digest poll. So how did they find people to poll? They used telephone books and car registration lists. And if you did that today, you'd get a pretty decent slice of the population, right? Seems totally reasonable. But, and this is the huge but, we have to remember this was 1936. We're talking right smack in the middle of the Great Depression. Back then, having a phone or a car was a luxury. By using these lists, they basically only polled wealthier folks who just so happened to prefer Landon. They completely missed the millions of lower-income voters who were FDR's biggest supporters. And that, right there, is a textbook case of undercoverage. All right, so we've got our first culprit, undercoverage. Case closed? Not so fast. That's not the whole story. There's another sneakier problem lurking in the shadows. What about the people who got selected for the survey but just never answered? Yeah, this one's a little trickier. It's what happens when the people who ignore your survey are different in some important way from the people who actually answer it. If those silent voices would have told a different story, then you've got yourself a serious case of non-response bias. And for our investigation, you gotta know there are a couple of types of non-responders. First, you have refusals. These are the people who straight up say, nope, not interested. Then you have the other kind, the ones you just couldn't get a hold of. Maybe they weren't home, maybe they didn't pick up. Either way, they leave a hole in your data that can really skew the results. So here's the good news. This is a problem we can actually do something about. Good researchers don't just throw up their hands. They'll use clever strategies, like trying to call back at a different time of day, or they might even offer a little something like a gift card just to get people to participate. It's all about making sure those silent voices get a chance to be heard. All right, time for our final clue. And honestly, this one might be the most fascinating because it's all about psychology. What happens when someone does answer the survey, but the answer they give isn't really how they feel? This is where we get into the tricky business of how people's answers can get twisted, even when they don't mean for it to happen. The way you ask a question, who's doing the asking, it can all subtly nudge people toward a certain answer, and that's called response bias. Okay, let's be honest with each other. You're sitting in the dentist chair. They lean in and ask, so have you been flossing every day? What do you say? Come on, you probably fudge it a little, right? Oh yeah, most days. That's what we call the interviewer effect. We're sort of wired to give the answer we think the other person wants to hear. And it's not just who asks, it's how they ask. Just look at the wording here. Using a word like destruction, that's so loaded, it's practically begging you to say no. A neutral question like, do you support reallocating park funds to other services, would get a totally different and probably more honest set of answers. Okay, so let's recap our investigation. We've got our three culprits: undercoverage, non-response bias, and response bias. Now it's time for the final verdict. In the world of stats, what do we actually call these kinds of screw-ups? And this slide right here, this is probably the most important takeaway of all. See, all those problems we found, those are called non-sampling errors. Think of them as human errors. They come from a bad plan, a flawed design, and the good news is you can fix them with a better plan. Then there's sampling error. That's different. That's not a mistake. It's just the natural, unavoidable fact that a small sample is never going to be a perfect mirror of the whole population. You can't get rid of it, but you can use math to account for it. The Literary Digest's epic failure wasn't because of bad math. It was because of these fixable human mistakes. So the next time you see a poll pop up in your newsfeed about an election or a new product, I want you to remember our 1936 case file. Don't just swallow the headline. Put on your data detective hat. Ask yourself, who'd they talk to? Who did they miss? How did they phrase the questions? Think like a data detective because now you know exactly what to look for.